Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.
My man, how are
Hey
you?
Mitch, how's it going?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
You sound great. Can you hear me
Oh,
okay?
good. Oh, just fine. Yeah, yeah. I am good to go. What a beautiful studio. Is that your recording studio?
This is not my personal recording studio, but it's a private recording studio, and they were generous enough to lend me the time to use it. And
Oh,
it's
that's wonderful.
certainly an upgrade from my iPad and a little clip mic. But
I know the feeling. Yeah, I've been there.
yeah,
You're in Bali, is that right?
yeah. I live in Ubud. Have you been here before?
No, I would love to visit.
Yeah, it's a magical place with a lot of deep and interesting traditions, a lot of interesting magical practices and things like that. And just the mythology and the culture is so rich. I barely understand it. I've barely scratched the surface of it, but
Wow.
basically just elaborate and very, uh, you know, complicated ceremonies all the time, like all the time. And you wake up sometimes at the sunrise and they've been going all night.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's
And
wild.
how are things going there with COVID?
It's actually really contained. Um,
Hmm.
they're not the most scientifically versed or scientifically minded in regards to
Yeah.
being able to actually cope with this type of a situation. So their logic around how to deal with it isn't really as strong as in, the United States and other places. But there's
Right.
very few cases here, and the freedoms that the people that live here have are exceptional compared to the rest of the world. There has not been any kind of real severe lockdown. I think we had to spend 2 days indoors, and that was
Uh-huh.
the main restriction. And otherwise, we need to wear masks in some places, and that's about it.
And is Bali under the governance of Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean,
Uh-huh.
Bali is its own, basically, cultural nation. It's Hindu, I mean, Hindu animist Balinese, and they have a really interesting shamanistic culture that's totally different from the rest of the kind of Muslim culture in Indonesia. But yeah, it
Mhm.
is still governed by Indonesia and falls
And
under
are
their
they
laws.
given religious and cultural? Is the public given religious and cultural freedom?
Yeah, the Balinese have a very,
Oh.
very strong religious culture that, it seems like nothing can tamper with. They've been doing their
Hmm.
ceremonies for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and their ways of being are very deep. I don't see
That's wonderful.
that going anywhere.
That's
Um,
wonderful. And where are you from originally?
I grew up in San Francisco, actually,
Oh.
or
Uh-huh.
just outside of San Francisco. I grew up in a small town called Mill Valley,
Oh,
just
sure.
out
Yeah.
out in the forest, kind of in the
Yeah.
suburbs of the city.
Nice. Well, you've had the good fortune to live in great places. That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And you're in New York City, right?
New York City, in Brooklyn right now. Yeah.
Nice. Cool,
Yeah.
man.
So ready to dive in.
Yeah.
Ready when you are. If the sound and the shot and everything is good. I have an overhead light on. I don't know if you'd like me to try to turn that off. It's maybe creating a little glare. You tell me.
I think it looks good, and I think
We're good to
primarily
go.
people are going to be listening to this anyway. But yeah, man,
But we're doing video. Is that right?
yeah, it's going to be posted on YouTube and then on,
Great.
you know, podcasting networks like
Cool.
Apple Podcasts, things like that.
Great. Great. Okay. Terrific.
Cool. So yeah, thank you, Mitch. Thank you for joining me. It's a real honor. I've been a big fan of your work. I've listened to I don't know how many hours of you speaking, and your depth of knowledge and the thoroughness, the extent, the breadth of your work is so impressive. You're such an expert on so many subjects related to the occult, to the paranormal, to manifestation, mysticism, of so many different subjects. And there's so many different things that we could, gear this conversation around. But it's such a coincidence or a synchronicity that this conversation occurs so close to Halloween. I promise I didn't plan that.
Oh, that's quite all right. First of all, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And one never has to, make any efforts at apology for scheduling anything with me close to Halloween, whether, by happenstance or otherwise. I can always tell Halloween season is beginning when I start to hear from the reporters for the Wall Street Journal or NPR who, want to talk about seances. I'm like, oh, of course, it's
Yeah.
early September, but for the rest of us, it's always a good time to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the occult for me is kind of a perennial subject for the
Yeah.
podcast. It's not something that only occurs on Halloween, but I appreciate Halloween because it's the time where being into this stuff is, not that weird, actually.
Right.
Where,
Right. No, it's
people,
a special time of year. It's
Yeah.
different, of course, now here in the States. Obviously, some of the traditions, including trick-or-treating, are going to be curtailed, because of COVID. And it's a different kind of Halloween, but one can feel it in the air, and it's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, we spoke briefly before about Balinese culture, but for them as an animistic culture, it's sort of like they live in Halloween perpetually, where every single day they have a relationship with the spirits of the dead and the ancestors, and they constantly do processions with costumes and things like that. But it's interesting how these themes seem to manifest throughout so many different cultures, days of celebration of the deceased, where the veil is thinner, where there's more
Yes.
access to these different, unseen realms of being and things like that.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful time. The Western tradition of Halloween, as you alluded, is going back to the Celtic age, is one in which the veil is thought to be thin between our world and the world that we don't see. And it's, of course, a time that obeys, at least here in the Western world, the agricultural cycles of life, to which it's very easy for Western people, urban Western folk, to become oblivious. The notion that, as our primeval ancestors did, it's time to bring the animals into the barns or into the fields to gather up our stores for the winter. It's a time to sleep more. It's interesting. I mean, right here, where I am in New York City, we're having a stretch of rainy, gray days, and it's kind of hard to get up and move around. Your joints feel creaky. And I remember a friend of mine, a practicing witch in Britain, was saying to me, boy, this is this time of year where I just feel like sleeping 13 hours a day. And of course, that is what our ancient ancestors did. I mean, they wouldn't quite hibernate, but they understood that there was a period of time where you just had to follow the cycles of nature and desist from some of the agricultural work that commanded your attention for the rest of the year. So it's interesting for us Western folk to get in touch, however intermittently, with those old cycles again.
This aesthetic quality of Halloween as being sort of evil or dark or spooky, do you think that has a historical precedent in regards to how it existed as an ancient tradition? Do you think there was more fear around the time of Halloween back in the time of the Celts and things like that?
It doesn't seem to me that the Celts were in any way fear-based as regarded Halloween or Samhain or any of the agricultural festivals that derived from it or were conducted in connection with spring or winter. One of the things I'm struck by is that the ancients experienced death as a much more palpable presence than we do, and lifespans were shorter and mortality rates were higher, and you really had to accept death as a sibling to life. Its presence was so palpably felt. And certainly in Britain, there would be crypts and burial mounds and other such structures created for the interment of the dead. And families would go and celebrate holidays at these places. They would leave behind food and drink and pottery. They would, in a sense, remain in the company of the dead because, again, death was a very palpably felt presence. It went hand in hand with life in a way that we in the modern world have attempted to distance ourselves from. But I don't think they had any fearful or sinister associations with the idea of there being a thinning veil between both worlds during festivals like these. It was really just more of a recognition that the cycles of life were common.
Right. Yeah, it seems like there's in Western culture a lot of fear that is associated with contact with the spirit world, and that it's almost always seen as being sinister. I guess that might come out of a program from Hollywood with a lot of horror movies being based around that particular subject. But do you think that that's a farce? Do you think that it's a, I mean, personally, I don't think there's anything essentially evil about the spirit world. I think that
Oh
it's
yeah, I agree.
populated with wildlife, much like the earth is, and there are, animals that are more dangerous than others, and some more maleficent and some more beneficent. But I don't think that there's something inherently evil about making spirit contact or having such practices. But that is one of the core themes of Halloween, is the kind of danger in that endeavor. I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I mean, that's a theme that is very alive and active for me right now. I think that we make too many distinctions in our culture, almost by way of recitation, by way of accepting decisions that have been made by other people and have been canonized by repetition. The idea that consorting with the spirit world is evil is, in some regards, an idea that has certain roots in biblical antiquity and that has more pronounced roots in the early establishment of the church, when it was very important from a political and civic perspective to the early church fathers to create a kind of exclusivity of mediation through the church. So the presence of mediums or soothsayers, or what we might call medicine men, or whatever terminology you want to use, was ardently discouraged, prohibited, and punished. And this idea that consorting with the medium world, with the unseen world, the spirit world, however one wants to think about it, places you at risk, is to me a trope that is validated by repetition. Because an idea is ancient doesn't mean that it's true. Because an idea is novel or new doesn't mean that it's shallow. We take risks all the time. We take risks being in contact with people on social media, for example, which is in a certain way a lot like consorting with the unseen world. The level of vitriol and anger that one experiences on social media is almost unprecedented in terms of its thickness, availability, in terms of how widely populated a world that we are able to plug into 24/7, that's filled with anger, sarcasm, rhetoric, of no value or worth. It's almost unprecedented that we've been able to reach out to so many people so frequently, so often, and experience such an ocean of hostility. So we take risks all the time in the 21st century, reaching out to people, dealing with people over social media and apps and so forth and so on. it's an inherent part of life. You're going to experience risks if you're inert. If you sit around passively, you're going to experience risks. They can either be perhaps deterred or even rushed toward. They're just a part of life. And if we coexist in physical and extra physical worlds, then contact in both is going to carry a certain degree of risk. I don't see that being unique to one or the other.
Right.
We have to experiment.
Just
it's
like
part of human nature.
Just like within the human community, there's people that you
Yeah.
probably wouldn't want to associate with because they're unsavory.
Mhm.
And likewise, within the spirit world, there are allies and enemies.
Yeah,
Those that have your back and those that don't.
Right. I don't see how it could be otherwise.
Yeah. I think it's a little small-minded to just lump it all into the category of forbidden or dangerous or evil without understanding the nuances of the different levels of that. Yeah, and we're
Hey.
back. Good.
Okay. All right. So tell me where we left off and I'll go back.
We were talking about how people like to generalize spirit contact as a generally bad thing. And we were saying that there are nuances within the spiritual world.
Right.
That having spirit contact isn't necessarily good or necessarily evil because it's inhabited by a multitude of different entities, that may have different intentions, much like people do.
Yeah, I used to get all these questions about the Ouija board. People are just fascinated in the US with the Ouija board. And I have a chapter about Ouija in my book, Occult America, which I somewhat sardonically titled "Don't Try This at Home." And I made at various points, I've noted the scary lore around the Ouija board, and I'm well aware of the reticence people have about using it, but I've gotten more relaxed about that as the years have gone by, simply because I don't want to put people off from experiment. And Ouija boards, for example, although this is a shrink-wrapped item with a barcode, sold in toy stores, have proved a novelty that have opened certain people up. For example, the poet Jane Roberts, who channeled the Seth teachings, began her metaphysical experiments using a Ouija board. The Pulitzer-winning poet James Merrill, who's absolutely wonderful, testified to channeling his most epic poetry through the use of a homemade Ouija board. I have a section about Merrill and his partner David Jackson in Occult America. There's a religion in the nation of Vietnam, Caudaism, or religion of the high palace. It's the third most popular faith in the nation, following Buddhism and Catholicism. And it had its earliest beginnings in the founders' experimentation with a Ouija board. So, those things that I'm referencing and much more wouldn't have occurred if somebody had been told, you're prohibited from using that. So these prohibitions need to be verified in everyone's life. And there are, as we were discussing earlier, there are risks inherent in everything, including in very benign activities, including in activities that are seen as morally neutral, like transportation or debt spending or what have you. So, I don't mean to minimize any of that, but I'm just trying to get at the fact that it's within the nature of life. And I don't want us to be put off from personal spiritual experiments because of what someone else has said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned seances before, and I did listen to some of your talks about the occult in America and how that influenced the nation. And it seemed like seances were a very important aspect and a very popular part of spiritual and occult culture in the 19th century. And I'm curious about that and what the prevalence of them, like what the significance of seances were for spirituality as it blossomed in the West. And I'm also curious as to why seances are not very popular anymore. Why did that tradition die out?
Those are interesting questions. Seances became popular in the U.S. in the mid 19th century. there are the historical antecedents that one could trace out, but the question is, why did they become popular so fully and so quickly? And I think there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that the best of the American mindset was possessed of a kind of do-it-yourself ethos in all areas of life. And it was appealing to many Americans that maybe it was possible to pierce the veil to the unknown with no intermediaries. You didn't need the man in the robes to provide you with guidance or approbation. And of course, there were higher mortality rates. There were very high infant mortality rates, and people had few ways to deal with grief. Seances also provided that for them as well. The practice was just huge throughout the latter half of the 19th century. I crunched the numbers as best as I can in Occult America, and I estimate that probably about 10% of the adult population was involved in seances in one fashion or another in the 1850s. It was just such a popular movement. And so today, of course, the traditional mid-19th century or Victorian age seance in which people join hands around a table is rarely experienced. The public doesn't seem to do it that way anymore. But nowadays, people frequent what we would call channelers or intuitives or mediums or psychics. So it's taken on a little bit of a different practice. It's not gone altogether, of course. But the trappings of the Victorian age seance, they seem to belong to our past, but yet in fact, they've morphed into different forms, different directions, usually involving a relationship with an individual channeler.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Something I really appreciated about listening to your talks on the history of the occult as it rose in popularity in America is that I'm a part of a primarily New Age culture, and most of the people I know are interested in mysticism to some extent through yoga, through meditation, through shamanism, things like that.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
yet I didn't know a lot about what you were talking about in regards to the history of spirituality in the West, and I think it's fascinating that so few people actually know about the rise in popularity and spirituality and the occult and in America and in Western culture, and how people like Helena Blavatsky influenced the the New Age, that she essentially created the foundation for New Age culture. Um, but I'm just curious what you think about that as well. Why there is this gap? Like, why have figures like H.P. Blavatsky, who were at the time very well known and well regarded and highly influential, been tucked under the rug more or less, aside from a few people in a particular kind of niche?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, Blavatsky is probably on the brink of a reconsideration today because she and the early Theosophy movement uh, proved so influential among so many different uh, parts of modern life in the West and the East. For example, a Sacred Bones Books is this year is reissuing an early 20th century book called Thought Forms, which was created by two second generation theosophists, Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant. And Thought Forms, in many regards, is the unacknowledged germination of abstract art. If you take a look at the plates in Thought Forms, you will see the earliest vestiges, not only of abstract art, but of what we much later would call psychedelia.
Wow.
Thought Forms, yeah, was created based on the authors entering into trance states, essentially describing what they experienced to artists with whom they worked, and these artists fantastically were able to translate the author's descriptions into painted plates and canvases, and the results speak louder than any words could, speak louder than any description could, speak louder than even the backstory itself, because the results are just absolutely sumptuously beautiful and have been widely credited by artists, though not by art historians as yet, as having formed the germination of the abstract art movement. Thought Forms was in the library of some of the earliest and most significant figures within the abstract art movement. And I'm collaborating with Sacred Bones and other people around the book and record label on this reissue. And I think it's going to just contribute to the connection between the occult revival that Theosophy instigated and the development of abstract art. And so that's just one example among many where I think early Theosophy and Blavatsky's influence is coming in for new scrutiny. And, you know, Madame Blavatsky is a confounding figure. You know, she's been damned as a fraud and a con artist and so forth, and celebrated as a revolutionary and an instigator. And, you know, she was a complex figure, and there is absolutely no way to get one's arms around her legacy in a easy or narrow way. She's going to be somebody we're going to be wrestling with for a very, very long time into the future.
Mm. Yeah, I was surprised to hear that she had such a great influence on Gandhi.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wrote about in Occult America. And, you know, people find it very surprising because, you know, we were talking about what happens in Halloween season. Well, you know, mainstream journalists are reaching out to me, and much of the time they want to talk about Hitler and the occult, a topic of perennial fascination, which I think has been overinflated. And one of the things that I always say is that Gandhi spoke very forthrightly in letters, in articles, in interviews from his youth up to just before his assassination about the influence that he received from Theosophy. He couldn't have been plainer about it. And I list a number of the references in Occult America. They're right there in his own language for anybody to see. It's not something that requires parsing or hunting through footnotes. It's something about which he wrote and spoke very plainly. And yet, you'll see very few cable television documentaries that make any reference to Gandhi and the occult, because there's less of a prurient interest. You know, we seem to take this, we derive a certain emotional thrill from finding connections between the occult and expressions of evil. And of course, we all have this prurient thrill culturally with Nazism and other such manifestations. Whereas influence is much more muted in a figure like Gandhi, and yet the occult connection to Gandhi is also more pronounced if one reads the history. And so I try to open a door to that in Occult America, and people often encounter that with disbelief, but that too is coming to be more accepted in scholarship and various historical studies.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that polarization is similar to the polarization of, you know, people thinking that spirit contact is inherently bad. I think there's a lot of fear around the occult, and I guess that probably comes from Christian influence or just organized religion in
Yeah,
general.
I think that's true. You know, I mean, look, every humanity is always involved in these kind of battles for influence, political influence, religious influence, cultural influence, civic influence. And it's not as if one side is the good guys and one side is the bad guys. You know, people are always trying to tell other people what to do. You know, essentially that's the core malady of human nature, the wish to tell others what to do. Tell somebody no and watch how they react. And, you know, you'll get a lesson in human nature that's all but universal. So, you know, in late antiquity in the West, you had a struggle between the early church and the old pagan powers. And the church obviously prevailed. And as is usually the case in these things, it classified the other side as the bad guys, as the people who were promulgating practices that were evil and that were unhealthful. And the fact is, if the pagan powers had prevailed, they would have done the same thing to the church. It's just human nature. It's the universal human story. It doesn't mean one group of people had good ideas, the other bad ideas. One group of people was wonderful, the other was terrible. It's just the human situation. So the victor gets to define the loser. That's been the story throughout a lot of the history of the human race, politically, religiously, culturally. So that's what happened to the occult.
And you see that bias even within the mythologies, how figures like Satan emerge out of pre-existing
Absolutely.
religious figures, and they demonize them literally to make them seem evil, to try to coerce people into different belief systems.
Yes, yes. And I see scripture as useful in many, many, many ways, because it's part of the mythos of how we understand ourselves. It's a book, Western scripture in all of its various books, forms, variants, the Apocrypha, the canonized works, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian addenda, and so forth. All of these things were written by human hands over the course of many, many, many centuries. And it's an extraordinary repository of insight, psychologically, sometimes historically, and I think sometimes spiritually, if I could speak in that language, speaking of the extra-physical. It's a repository of insights into how humanity has understood its own development in the Western world, and it's been subject to widely varying interpretation. But interpretation is an act of the human psyche. And I think we can return to scripture, look at certain references, as I do sometimes, references to the Hebrew-derived being identified as Satan, and scrutinize it for a different story, a different truth that's valid, justifiable, defensible, and can be found, within the folds of this document. It falls to each generation to do that. It doesn't mean you're freewheeling, but it means you're returning to the source and asking what has been omitted, what has been left out.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the mythologies and stories of the scriptures are a kind of propaganda to seed certain types of thought patterns, certain types of behaviors for the people that read them. And I'm particularly,
and it's an issue.
Oh, well, I was
Please,
just going to say I'm particularly curious about the story of Lucifer and what that represents, because I know that there's an association with Lucifer and Venus, the morning star, and it had Venus having the qualities of the natural world, of femininity, of fertility, and all these things, and for that to be labeled as evil, and also the idea, to me, the mythology of Lucifer represents recognizing one's own divinity and basically claiming ownership over that, and not being forced to be subjugated underneath this kind of demagogue that stands over you as an authority figure, but recognizing the creative potential within each of us. And it seems to me that Lucifer as a character discovered that, and he was punished for it.
Yes, I mean, there are so many different themes that intersect with scripture. I mean, you're also voicing some Gnostic themes, which are very important to the human story. And speaking in the strictest historical terms, it's probable that the earliest references to the luminous one, or what later came to be called Lucifer, derived out of the Latin Vulgate, was to the vanquished king of Babylon. But you find within scripture an admixture of both historical, psychological, parabolic, spiritual references. And from the pastiche of these references emerges truths, I think, about the human psyche, and also truths, as can be found in all mythologies. I use that term in the highest iteration. In all mythologies that the human race has used to tell its story, you find scent trails of ideas about extra-physical energies, deific energies extant in the natural world that our ancient ancestors sought relationships with, sought to petition, personified as beings, whether called Zeus or Minerva or Set or Hermes. Our ancient ancestors felt that energies could be deified, could be personified, could be petitioned. We could form relationships with these energies. And that's something I'm personally very, very interested in today. That forms a deep part of my own practice and my own search today. And I encourage people, if this material is appealing to them, if it speaks to them, to explore that within their search. I don't take a metaphorical view of these energies. I think that we have extra-physical elements of life to which we can relate, and sometimes we relate to things by personifying them. And I think the ancients provided us with a method and a means of relating to the unseen that we can experiment with today.
Mm. Speaking on the subject of deities and relating to these energies, I'm really curious about your thoughts on Satanism. I had read some of your articles on Medium about it, and I thought you spoke very clearly about your ideas with it. I had read the Satanic Bible when I was in high school, and for a period of time considered myself to be a Satanist, and I was also an enthusiast of black metal, and it kind of comes with the territory. But I went to the same high school as Anton LaVey, actually.
Oh, no kidding.
Which was kind of cool. And reading the book there was, there was something kind of nice about that. But, it was something that it served a purpose for me at that time. I think it was really empowering for me because, the idea that you didn't need to be subjugated to somebody else's belief system, that you can be radically autonomous, that really was good medicine for me at the time. But I guess that as I kind of grew and explored other spiritual traditions, including Buddhism and shamanism and a lot of things, I kind of like cast it aside as just, one of those things you get into when you're a teenager. But it's funny how these things come back. I also explored, I read my first books by Aleister Crowley when I was in high school and started to explore a bit of ceremonial magic and stuff like that. And I've been getting much more into that now in my adult life, and things like Satanism also have been coming back to be revisited and to be understood anew. So I'm just really curious what Satanism is to you and what Satan represents, and how that's a good navigating system for you as you sail upon the seas of chaos that is life.
Yes, well, I appreciate that question. I have my own very individualized, but I also think historically grounded and theologically coherent and defensible version of the Satanic. I write about it extensively in a series of articles, as you alluded, at Medium, called God of the Outsiders, which is also the subject of the title of a lecture I delivered on the topic in New York and in Los Angeles, which is linked under that banner at Medium and can be found on YouTube. I see the Satanic and I make a reading of various sources in Western literature as the source of usurpation, rebellion, radical individualism, anti-heroism of a sort that objects to and upends conformity, dominating power. I see the Satanic as the force of opposition that drives men and women to grow, to expand. If it weren't for friction and opposition, which we all experience in life, we would remain intellectually and emotionally children. William Blake wrote famously, opposition is true friendship. That's my conception of the Satanic, the force that impelled Adam and Eve in the Western creation myth to eat from the tree of forbidden knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they were expelled from paradise and experienced friction, without which humanity wouldn't be itself. Humanity would be an unrecognizable, kept being.
I think Thoth Hermes is as good a deity of Wi-Fi as there would ever be.
Yeah, right.
So let's try to invoke Hermes here to
Yes, I
to
like
make this
that.
connection go smoothly.
Right, exactly. That's our tech support. We'll make t-shirts. Hermes is my IT guy or something. Yeah. Okay.
For sure.
Yeah. So I think I could pretty much take up from where we were. Let's see. So just give me 1 second to recollect where we were. As soon as I saw myself as the host, I knew it had gone out. So let me just think back to 1 second. So in a certain sense, the serpent in the garden in Genesis 3 can be seen as the primordial truth teller. And that doesn't mean that learning the truth represented harmony. It represented the creativity and destruction, without which humanity would not be itself. So theologically, that's a critical jumping off point for me. And my sources for what I define as the satanic, as this usurping force of nonconformity, of opposition, of creativity, of revolution, psychically defined, is found in many different areas of Western writing that I consider profound. The work of William Blake, which I quoted earlier, the work of John Milton, the work of the Romantic poets. Shelley wrote a wonderful play called Cain, which is rarely read today, which presents the Cain and Abel story from the perspective of Cain and Lucifer, and I think is possessed of just extraordinary insights. I link many of my sources in an article called The Devil's Reading List, which can be found at Medium. And I come up through contemporary sources, including Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, writings by Michael Aquino. And Anton is a figure who, to me, is just a fascinating artist and thinker, performer, magician. My view of the Satanic somewhat differs from his own. He, as you were alluding, extolled the primacy of the individual. I probably have a more of a metaphysical view of life, probably more of an extra physical view of life. I don't think that was entirely missing from Anton's work, but it's certainly more pronounced in my approach, more theistic in outlook.
Right.
In that sense, I probably take a lot of inspiration from the work of Michael Aquino. His writings, the Diabolicon and the Book of Coming Forth by Night, have been meaningful to me. And so those are figures who I also include in the spectrum of works that have inspired my own perspective on the satanic, which is highly individualized in a certain sense, as it must be. There's an anarchistic quality to probing satanic material. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to doctrine or orthodoxy. It's that which upends doctrine and orthodoxy.
I agree with everything you just said, yet I still feel uncomfortable to a degree to call myself a Satanist.
Yes.
Because the association, like for me, Satan is the egregore of ultimate evil, all the kind of like bad qualities of humankind, or something like that. I think that's generally what people would ascribe it to. It's just a neat box that they could fit that very large concept into,
Yes.
and I understand LaVey as a kind of an iconoclast and a contrarian, and wanting to use that term to provoke people, and
Yes.
I get that there's a lot of that. I mean, Satanism is very provocational,
Mhm.
but I just wonder, couldn't the ideas and the beliefs that you hold, that you call Satanism, be just as valid without necessarily calling it that? Because just the name alone provokes such a strong and generally negative reaction in people. People associate with, like, child sacrifice and a lot of things like that. It doesn't, the word Satanist has a lot of negative connotations.
Oh yeah, you're correct. Of course, the cultural barriers are immense, and the cultural barriers may be such that I'll never be able to scale them. I made a decision years ago that I was determined to use very plain, very blunt language in connection with my writing and my search, provided I felt that that language possessed historical integrity, regardless of the connotations that have been attached to it. So, for example, I use the term occult very freely, and I do my very best to explain my historical use of that term. I've had certain theosophical lodges and other organizations, ironically, ask me, why must I use that term, even though it was Madame Blavatsky who reintroduced occult into modern life, and they would prefer a term like esoteric or mysticism. I use the term New Age very freely, as you have, and I appreciate that. I view New Age as a radically ecumenical culture of therapeutic spirituality. I'm aware when I use the term New Age that it's very frequently used as an epithet for everything that's considered squishy or trendy or fuzzy-headed in spirituality. I use the term ESP, even though the term psi or psychical is favored over ESP. I think that term, for various reasons, has historical integrity. So I made the decision to do the same with the satanic, because I was drawing upon inspiration from LaVey, from other contemporary sources, from scripture, where the term is derived from a Hebrew root. It may be, as you're alluding, you're making fair points, and it may be that I've met my match. It may be that even I cannot overcome the cultural connotations of Satanism, and that no matter how clearly I endeavor to explain my outlook, my historicism, my theology, there's just no pushing back against the baggage with which that term is weighted. You may be correct. I may have met my match, but I did make the decision to use that term in a way that I intend to be individualized, integral, to redeem something. I usually, in my writings, in my public work, in my private search, I usually get very bound up in the principle of defending something, of wanting to set right a wrong, of wanting to restore something that's been displaced. And what you have identified is my greatest challenge yet. And it may be too great, even for me. I'll have to live with that. I'll have to live with that. But it's a decision that I made.
I like it because so much of the ideology around Satanism is about the shattering of taboos, and by you using the term, you're seeking to push the taboo. So it's like it serves a purpose unto itself, just by
Appreciate
using
that.
the word, And
Yes.
I think also the word God carries almost as much cultural baggage as the word Satan does, and is another one that can it's difficult to use without it being associated with a lot of different ideas, and
That's
a
true.
lot of painful experiences in certain cases, from people that were brought up in strict religious homes and things like that.
In many ways, the entire Western mindset has been structured on this binary view that you were just alluding to. And I suppose, that it may be like trying to hold back, the ocean, with a leaf blower, but that's the task to which I've set myself. I question this binary view. I question the foundations of that decision making in antiquity that resulted in the Western mindset of higher and lower, good and evil, underworld and heaven. As above, so below is my principle, and so that's what I am. That's the wind that I'm throwing myself into.
Mm. Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mitch. I think that that's the mark of a true seeker, that you're willing to go into places that people would consider to be forbidden, to only take the prescribed routes, but you're willing to go into places like the occult, which some people would consider dangerous, or into Satanism, which certainly probably most people would consider to be, forbidden, taboo, dangerous to some extent.
Yeah, yeah. The results of my success will be private. I will share them publicly, but the results are ultimately felt in the confines of one's life, in conduct, in outlook, in attitude, and in relationships. So I will have to judge the success or failure of my search based on uh, private results, based on intimate results, which I will share. My work and my search are one and the same, and I will share what I found. I've done my best to provide a running record of that up to this point.
Mm. I just wanted to ask a couple things about Satanism in general, in terms of specifics. Something that I recall reading is, and I disagreed with, there are many aspects of it that I agree with, but the idea that your kindness or your love or your affection is something that you shouldn't dispense with generously, that you should, I believe, this is what I recall reading, that you should only kind of dispense with kindness to those that quote unquote deserve it. And that was I what I understand of that, and from people I've known who are practicing Satanists, is that it has a lot to do with energy conservation. The idea that our energy, our power, our life force is very precious, and that you shouldn't dispense of it too generously, because you could be drained by people. But I'm curious just about what you think of that, and if you agree with it.
Sure. I appreciate that question very much. We as a culture very readily use terms like service, giving back, do unto others. And yet very little of that actually goes on within our society, most especially among those who speak loudest about it. There's a Talmudic principle, beware the man who bespeaks his own virtues. And that reappears in many different forms and in many different ways. Some of the most ruthless and spiteful people I've ever met are people who speak in terms of service. People who speak about the idea of loving and charity and turning the other cheek and doing unto one's neighbor, are people who have proven some of the most spiteful, callous people I've ever come across. There's a great empathy, there's a great sympathy in leaving other people alone, for example, not wanting to tell other people what to do. I think we go out of our way sometimes to want to tell other people what to do. You see this all the time on social media, for example. There seems to be this inability to just say nothing. If you encounter a point of view that you don't like for whatever reason, you have the option to say nothing. Entire relationships are destroyed simply because somebody demonstrates the inability to leave another person alone. I always encourage people to ask themselves, is this necessary, before commenting on something? Is this necessary? That question could be revolutionary if asked sincerely. So I think there is a great deal of misuse, insincere use of terms like kindness and service and so forth. Whether one should be withholding of kindness, I'm not so much possessed of that outlook, but I think it should be practiced in real ways and sincerely. There's a wise person who once said, the only things that you can really give to another individual are time or money. And of course, one immediately wants to argue with that statement. One immediately wants to reject and push back against that statement because it is so realistic. It is so realistic. The idea that I can be generous to you by listening to you, by empathy. Well, sure, that's sort of true. But time or money is what most individuals are in deepest need of. That's what keeps people up at night. That's what creates maladies of stress in people's lives when they don't have the means and the resources to find security in life. So if one can provide that, and if it's real, and if it's concrete, and if the disbursement is sincere, to me, that's authentic. I don't speak in terms of service. I don't really think in those terms. I think in terms of reciprocity. I think in terms of human connectedness. I think there is a human wholeness, again, as above, so below. And I'm trying, to wrestle with this in terms of my own search. And I'm writing about this in a forthcoming book, which is called The Miracle Month. It's a series of exercises that you conduct over a space of 30 days. And I was very affected by something recently, which I'll share with you publicly for the first time. I read about this in the book. I was in Mexico recently, and with my significant other, Jacqueline Castel, a brilliant filmmaker. And we were on the beach in the Yucatan, and there's these poor kids who go up and down the beach attempting to sell trinkets and things to the tourists. And one looks at these kids and wonders, why are they not in school and what's happening in their lives? And I was seated a distance away from where one of these kids encountered a group of tourists. I think these tourists were from Spain. They were they were Spanish-speaking folk, very chic, very beautiful. And one of the men in this crowd had ordered some food, and he gave the food, in this case, like chips and guacamole, to one of the kids. And he did this several times with different poor groups of kids who were walking up and down the beach. And he was speaking to them, and they were conversing, and he was giving them this food, and it wasn't being done in any kind of a showy way. And he certainly didn't know that I was watching. I was back behind him a good many feet. And I was very touched by it, because I thought to myself, these poor kids have a very difficult life. And so here is a guy who, at least in the space of an afternoon, made an act of authentic kindness to them, not being afraid that they would mob him, not being afraid that they would come back asking for more, whatever it is, that goes through people's minds. He just offered them food, drink, chips, talked to them. So those kids had a better afternoon than they otherwise might. And I thought to myself, there's something beckoning me in that. I have not been right enough in that way. I've been trying ever since that particular episode to ask myself, what is required of me? What do I owe? What does reciprocity require of me if I take that concept seriously? And I was very moved by what I saw, because it was done without drama, flourish, publicity. You could buy every trinket in the world from a kid walking up and down a beach, for the next 100 days, and it wouldn't do anything to set right economic disparities. But in a small way, the disbursement of kindness to another individual, if done authentically, which usually means resources, seems to me something that is required if one takes seriously the principle of reciprocity. I take seriously the principle of reciprocity. So this is something that I'm working with at the present time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's, the example you just gave is certainly counter to my impression, at least, of what the satanic outlook on the world would be,
Well, life has a way of dealing in opposites. The people who speak the loudest, or who wear labels that bespeak their own goodness, bring to bear one experience in life, and the people who are supposed to be The ones to watch out for bring to bear inexperience in life, and these things are very often surprising. Life reveals itself in opposites, and I have argued that in terms of the human psyche, there's no good and evil. There's empathy and spite, and the way to determine whose company you're in is to determine where somebody falls within that scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I would say that some of my kindest friends are also the scariest looking. And there's something about that interesting kind of irony about how sometimes the hardest looking folk are also the softest underneath all that. But
As above, so below.
as above, so below. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Something I also wanted to talk to you about, if you have a little bit more time, is so much of your work deals with manifestation. I've really appreciated the work that you've done in clarifying and putting out the ideas of new thought and mind metaphysics and things like that. And I really appreciate that you honor desire as
Oh,
being
yes,
something sacred. And this is
absolutely.
also very counter to what would be typical within, a good spiritual person's supposed to just transcend their ego and transcend all their desires. But how many friends do I have in spiritual communities that are, broke, and it's causing them a lot of stress? And there is something to the things that we need and we want. And the more I have gotten away from that idea, that the way to handle desire is to try to meditate them out or to transcend them, and to instead actually strategize and enacting them, and to actually make it a reality. I feel like I'm actually much happier with the latter method.
Oh,
So
yeah. That's been my experience. I should clarify, I don't speak in terms of manifestation. I speak in terms of selection. That's something I read about in my book, The Miracle Club, where I feel that our perspective, our assumptions, our emotionalized thoughts and pictures, I think have a causative dimension to them. And I think there's an act of selection that's going on in such cases. And I read about that in greater detail in the Miracle Club. I do consider desires sacred and something that should be honored. I think that non-attachment, non-identification, and all such terms have been grossly misapplied to the life of the 20th and 21st century seeker. I think a person can feel torn in two by attempting to walk a spiritual path of so-called non-attachment and non-identification, whereas I believe the point of our existence is to be generative, is to create. If one takes seriously the scriptural notion that the Creator fashioned the individual in its own image, then it stands to reason that you, the individual, are here to create. I think one finds precedent for that within Hermeticism as well, a philosophy that's very important to me. I think the individual feels most alive, and in fact is unable to feel alive, at ease, at home, relaxed, absent acts of generativity, productivity, creation, whatever those may be. And to suggest that the individual should feel non-attached to result, to outcome, I don't think that's something that I can verify as workable philosophy in my own life. It doesn't matter to me how deeply it resonates in translations of translations of translations of spiritual literature. It's important to remember every religious philosophy was fashioned by the hands of man. And it stands to reason that whatever universal principles one finds in different spiritual philosophies, whether Vedic, Buddhist, Judaic, Christian, you name it, those philosophies are also bound to a certain time and place and meant to address civic, cultural needs of individuals in different times and places. In many regards, some of our earliest religious philosophies were fashioned in a time and cultural situation where the individual could no more expect to move outside of the class or caste role that he or she was born into than they could expect to walk the surface of another planet. So sometimes these philosophies are not necessarily able to be projected in all their facets onto life in the present. We certainly don't do that with ancient Judaic law, for example. And I think that these things require verification by every generation and ultimately every thinking and feeling individual in his or her own life. And I think that creativity, productivity, generativity is the imperative bursting within every human life. The power to see through, to enact one's plans in the world in some measure, even if it differs ultimately from whatever I hold in my mind's eye, is so deeply felt. I think most of what we describe as neurosis is a disruption of this creative, or what I might describe as this power-seeking impulse. That doesn't mean, as we were discussing earlier, that you or I or anyone listening is free from reciprocity. My definition of ethics is reciprocity. So the seeking of power, the seeking of attainment, words that people are afraid to use because they think it somehow is a rupture with spirituality, these things I think are vital to human happiness. Likewise, they don't free us, they don't free me from some sort of cosmic reciprocity, which is at the back of all ethics. Isn't empathy and reciprocity at the back of all authentic ethics? I don't take a go-it-alone approach to life, not at all. But nor will I avoid blunt language or seek to disguise what I'm articulating in a kind of spiritual language. I will not say, "Thy will be done," when what I really mean is "my will be done," and I'm just really hoping that it comports with higher will. Or I'll try to rearrange my will a little bit so that it fits within the framework of what's wanted by higher will. I think we play these games with ourselves because we feel torn in two by our spiritual philosophies. And I'm trying to come to an expression of a spiritual philosophy. By spiritual, I mean extra-physical. I think we occupy both physical and extra-physical realms. I'm trying to come up with an expression of a spiritual and ethical philosophy that's authentic to my experience, that has consistency, that has integrity, that has ethics, but is also undisguised in describing my situation. And in describing my situation, I hope I'm describing something more universal, because I certainly can't imagine that my life is exceptional. So when we search, we also help find truths for one another.
Mm. Yeah, I completely agree. And I do think that thoughts are causative. That's a very fundamental experience that I've had in my life. And I love the work that you've done to really elaborate upon that idea and to clarify it in a very profound way. One aspect of that gets criticism, though, is, do bad things happen to people based on people's thoughts? And honestly, I believe the answer is yes. I believe that just like you can use psychic energy focused into a particular intention to help boost the probability of the occurrence of something, I think that likewise, if fears or worry, these types of thoughts go unchecked, that they can also carry a certain momentum that can be causative. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that my hero Neville Goddard made the statement, "An assumption, though false, if persisted in, will eventually harden into fact." And I would surmise that almost everyone, to some greater or lesser extent, would agree with that. Even if somebody takes a materialist view of life, psychologically, they would probably say, "Yeah, I understand the truth of that statement." If somebody takes a more metaphysical view of life, that statement might take on even greater dynamism. I think we live under many laws and forces, or at least we experience many different laws and forces. The reason I don't use the term law of attraction, for example, is I don't believe that life is necessarily subject to one mental super law, although it may be in the ultimate sense. I mean, in the ultimate sense, I do believe that that intelligence is ultimately the arbiter of existence, but I'm speaking on a scale that's very difficult for me to relate to. We certainly experience multiple laws and forces, including laws of physical decline and mortality. There's never been any exception to that. I once asked a evangelical Christian, you know, would that statement square with his theology that there's never been any exception to mortality? And he said, yes, you know, I mean, we do understand theologically speaking from a Christian perspective that Christ died on the cross. I just felt that was a conversation and exchange that I wanted to pursue. And so I think we have to accept that the physical framework in which we operate is fundamentally felt and functional in our lives. And yet, I do believe that we are able to relate to higher principles. I do believe that there are serial realities from which we might be able to select among, which is why I use the term select versus manifest. I also believe that we as human beings have to understand that our emotional states, including so-called negative emotional states, are not always things that we are able to dispel or walk away from. Sometimes these emotional states might be very valid. You know, it could be that sometimes you or I or someone else is simply an agent of someone's karma, and we may harbor feelings towards somebody that could be colloquially described as negative, that may be justifiable. But it's for the individual to really, really, really search that and take that very seriously from an emotional perspective. You know, I think that our emotions are very, very strong, and they don't always require fixing. And we're not always capable of fixing them, so to speak, from the perspective of the religious traditions as they've come down to us. And we have to examine that. We have to ask ourselves questions about that. That's also something that I've been working with. I wrote a piece called "Forgiveness: A Descent," and I've aired some of my questions about whether forgiveness, which is a principle that is absolutely at the center of Christianity, is always functional and right and helpful within the framework that we occupy. It sounds like a verboten question, but no question is verboten if it doesn't demean or objectify or promulgate violence, unprovoked violence against another individual. It is a question. I take responsibility for my own spiritual experiments. I don't visit them on other people. So that's something I've been considering within my own search. These are all questions that we have to work through and verify for ourselves to whatever degree is possible. But I do believe that which we focus upon is fertilized. There's no question of that in my mind. But what that means and what outcome we're desirous of, or what tendency, trait, or action we're trying to see through in the world is a very individual consideration.
Yeah, actually, just today I listened to your interview with Duncan Trussell where you're talking about forgiveness and how it, you know, at times is actually a stifling.
I believe so.
That it's stifling, that it doesn't actually enable you to move forward in a way that's constructive, and that was really eye-opening. I think that level of questioning is really deep. It's obviously the way that you approach just life and the world in general, is that you deeply question these things that are kind of served to us and most people just accept as reality.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Something I wanted to ask you is kind of a technical question in regards to the work that you do with the Miracle Club. You mentioned this technique by Neville Goddard where you visualize an outcome that you'd like to see as you're going to sleep or waking up. And I've used this technique and it's effective, but I'm also familiar with the kind of, you know, chaos magic techniques of trying to increase the probability of an outcome. And there's an emphasis within the sigil magic, chaos magic techniques of forgetting about
Yes.
your desires, that to focus too much within the conscious mind on your desired outcome actually hinders the probability of it being realized. So I'm curious what you think about that, because those two techniques seem to be in opposition.
That's a really wonderful question, and that's a very hot question for me personally right now. And I think you framed it rightly. You know, the New Thought approach, in many cases, is visualizing intent. The chaos approach, in many cases, is ritualizing intent and then forgetting about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the two seem contradictory. It seems to me that the capacity to live with paradox is perhaps the most important trait to possess on the spiritual path. The spiritual path persistently presents us with paradox. And I've seen people, colleagues of mine, almost tear themselves in two by continually trying to get the recipe just right. You know, do I add a pinch of salt? Do I do this? Do I do that? You know, or people kind of getting into these doctrinaire places where you have to forget about it. No, you have to focus on it. Oh, you have to live from the end. You have to do this. You have to pray as though having already received, and all these things have different antecedents, but yet you can also find antecedents that directly contradict them. I wrote an article recently called "Is Magic Necessary?" in which I asked the question of whether, all of these things are almost a commentary or almost secondary. If our minds possess extra physical abilities, which I believe they do, then is aware intention in and of itself simply enough to accomplish the things that we look to ritual, liturgy, doctrine, prayer, practice to accomplish? Are all of those things the finger pointing at the moon, so to speak, and the moon being the mind itself? Is aware intention kind of a superseding stage to the practices, rites, and rituals of these various schools? It's a question. That's something that I wonder aloud in that article. I believe that contradiction or paradox should not prove a barrier. I think that there may be times, certainly true in my life, where the approach of Neville, for example, is desirable. There may be times where a chaos approach is desirable. There may be times where I dwell on something. There may be times where I dwell on something and I also decide to do a work of sigil magic, in which the principle is, you let the ritual serve as satisfaction and you forget all about it. I mean, someone could look and say, well, gee, you've got it all wrong. You're messing up all these ingredients. You're baking a cake with sugar and salt, and you're going to just, mess it all up. Well, it's my experiment. It's my prerogative. I may, something may occur that's wonderful. Something may occur that's inconclusive. Something may occur that gives me a new way of working. So I have to work with all these paradoxical insights. I just have to. The success or failure is in conduct, is in relationship, is in outcome, is in happiness, and the individual can only determine those things for him or herself.
And they both work,
They both work. Isn't it odd?
So,
yeah.
And the one thing they have in common, as you said, is aware intention. So perhaps it's not even about the actual technique. It's more about having the intention to realize the thing.
It could be. That's what I explore in that article. And that's like a very critical part of my search right now.
Well, awesome, Mitch. I think that it's best for both of us to have the freedom to go on. But thank you so much for joining me. If there's any kind of like pressing last thoughts that you have that you'd love for our listeners to hear.
I just appreciate the openness of your questions. You know, I do these podcasts with people who are also searchers, also seekers. Your listeners are seekers, and I just greatly appreciate the bluntness of your questions. These are things that help me work through my search, and I view these kinds of encounters as a real exchange. If anybody wants to reach me, you can go to my website, which is mitchhorowitz.com. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz, on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. And I'm always interested in hearing from people who are authentically seeking.
Thanks, Mitch. And you just released a new book, am I right? The Seeker's Guide to Manly P. Hall.
The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's a companion book to Manly Hall's epic Secret Teachings of All Ages, and I'm very proud of it. I sort through a lot of different ideas in that book about the mystical roots of the mainstream religions, about topics as wide-ranging as tarot, Kabbalah, Egyptian history, and so on. And it's divided into 12 chapters, and I think it makes a really lovely companion to the Secret Teachings.
Excellent. Yeah, I can't wait to read it. Well,
Thank you, man.
Well, thanks again, Mitch. This was awesome.
Thank you. Good to be with you. All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Much love. Be well.
Happy Halloween. All right.
Happy Halloween.
Bye. Bye.
The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J.